We are super excited to show you guys this machine. I used to watch this back on Jesse James on Motorcycle Mania, where he would shape fenders on a power hammer and Pullmax machines. And let me tell you, there is a lot more to this machine than I ever thought there was. So going back in time, 2019, we started diving into metal shaping courses. I took a class with Flying Dutchman Industries. If you guys don't follow him on Instagram, that's his handle. And it was more of a very basic, here's this machine, here's what this machine does. And everything seemed very easy when somebody's there holding your hand. There were so many things that I didn't know. I mean, you would grow up watching these shows with Jesse James where they're using a Pullmax or a power hammer and get excited because you see all of the possibilities that you can make with your own two hands. It's an art form at that point, and it's something that's whatever you can create in your head or modify your custom car to any one specific shape or form. But I have been with this machine on a bucket list item now for 4 or 5 years, and we're excited to actually get one here. This is a P21 Pullmax. From what I have researched, this is the granddaddy of the Pullmax family. There are different variations of what that is, but as far as the shank sizes and stuff like that, this was the one to get. We bought this to be using on the 61 Impala project. Now, that project is one of our first few big full build projects where we're cutting the entire floor out, the trunk, the firewall. We're making everything one-off from scratch. So it's whatever I can create in my mind to flow with the chassis and the firewall and the engine bay. And I felt like this was the next step. Now, we've taken metal shaping courses from Jake. We've taken metal shaping courses with Lazzy Metal Shaping up in Pismo Beach. And I've been collecting more and more tools in the last 2 months. So I've always had a bead roller, and I had an older Metal Ace English wheel. And we've recently switched a lot of that out because as our skills got better and I learned how much better a better tool was, I saw the value there and it just made sense to sell. I sold my Mittler Brothers bead roller. We bought a Lazzy bead roller. We did the same thing with the English wheel, sold the Metal Ace, got a Lazzy English wheel. And this was the last of my, I would call it, first stage of metal shaping equipment. What exactly does a Pullmax do? It does a variation of things that are very similar to a bead roller, but you have other options there that a bead roller can't do. A bead roller has 2 rotating shafts, an upper and a lower, and depending on what your dies are, you get that shape of the dies. This is a reciprocating hammer. So it has a solid lower die and it has a reciprocating upper die that is hammering into one another. But what I didn't know was all of the things in between other than what I saw in the class. And in the class, they were shaping a roof to a travelall, putting the beads for the entire duration evenly spaced out, and it came out really nice looking. From that point on, I knew that was a machine that I wanted to get. I didn't really realize is how much technique actually goes into just something as simple as feeding something through these jaws and how the setup of the machine actually goes. When I started setting this machine up day one, the only references that I had other than watching somebody else use the machine for maybe a 20-minute period was YouTube. It was doing exactly what you guys are doing right now. I binge watched tons and tons of different YouTube videos. William Tremblay was probably one of the best explanations, but there was just a few things that I had to kind of connect the dots because I think a lot of people forget what those very beginning infant steps were on just the simple things of setting the machine up. I want to walk you guys through exactly how to get started with this machine. Maybe this machine is in the shop that you work at. You'd like to use it, but maybe you're a little timid. I was, and since it's mine, I can mess it up, right? Number one, this machine is a 3-phase, and my little shop is all single phase. I bought this machine from Untouchable Metalwork from Instagram. That's his handle as well. His little side hustle is selling Pullmax machines. These machines are from Sweden. This machine's a roughly 50 years old. What it does is this reciprocating hammer, you have an adjuster that you can give 4 different indexes on how low it goes down to the lower die. So number 1, as I was saying with the power, we have converted this machine to single phase. It uses a phase converter, and it's pretty nice because Jose sells them where it's a plug and play thing that same day. It was great. We literally unloaded it off the trailer and we had it running the day we got it. It just uses 220 off a plug over to my wall. We have the safety buttons here in the front. Most of the ones, they've bypassed this, but this one's kind of nice because he retained all of these buttons for safety. It's nice because you're typically operating the machine from the right-hand side or in the front. And if your phase converter is mounted on the side or in the back, and you're working with a part that maybe is so large you can't get to the back to shut it off, it's nice to be able to just hit the red button and kill the power while you're in the middle of making the part. What you're gonna do when you first fire it up, and in my case, I have to hit the button and then I have to go to the phase converter, hit one more button to turn it on. This machine takes a couple seconds to get rolling. I was actually pretty shocked. It's a pretty quiet machine overall, but this will bring it down and you can see the die move down closer to the other. There is a certain amount of clearance that you need between your lower die and your upper die, and that changes with the material thickness. This lever is how much the stroke moves. You can see right now it almost doesn't look like it's moving, and you can actually touch it, it's just vibrating. Where each time I go up, it's the stroke that is moving more. Those were the basic functions that I would watch on YouTube and realize in my head that, oh yeah, I got this, let's go run the machine. The things that I failed to realize, which I didn't know anything about, was how do you adjust the die? Is the die gonna crash? What's gonna happen when I hit the button? Is that stroke gonna just open up and smash into the bottom one? Thankfully, if you have a pretty good gap in here, you can fire the machine up as long as this lever is in all the way the up position. More so, I wanna get into these dies in how they actually come out of the machine. First and foremost, let's get into how do you actually remove the dies? How do you set up the dies? Because this is a lower holder, which is held in by a retainer nut. If you loosen the retainer nut, and as long as this lever is all the way up, you can slide out the die holder. These dies, this is a collet. The collet, all right. Now the first die that I'm going to show you guys is the thumbnail shrinking dies. Thumbnail, it looks like a thumb in the actual die. That's where it gets the name. But let me tell you, I had never used these before, and the video that we did last week on the Mustang sail panel, we had just put the machine in during that video, and I didn't realize that there is a level of finesse to these things. I just thought that it would, I don't know what I thought. I've watched several videos and I could see that it would shrink inner wheel well right over. And why the heck I decided to take some part that needed barely any shrink and run it through this just because I was excited, it tacoed the part pretty good. We had a sail panel that needed very little shrink and we redid it because we ran it through this machine and it just shrunk the whole piece right over extremely fast. Thumbnail shrinking dies, I want to give you guys kind of all of the do's and don'ts as I have been playing with this thing the last 24 hours. You have the lower die holder. Now these are 19 millimeter square shafts that the collet holds. The collet comes out of a threaded piece, and when it pushes down on the collet, it actually squeezes the square shaft, and that's what holds it into the lower holder. If you notice, when this was together, there's not a lot of room between these upper and lower dies, and right now we're actually looking for the shorter collet. They make a shorter collet, and I have not been able to find any online. So if you guys are metal shapers, or maybe you have one laying around and you want to get rid of it, please shoot me a message or an email. I am looking for the set to give me more clearance for a bigger die. And we're gonna get into that here shortly on custom dies. You put this into the collet. And then, once you know which way you want it to index, you put it into the lower holder. and you just thread that guy on there. What's nice is you have a side, 2 set screws, 1 on each side. In the middle here, you have a tapered end, and what that tapered end does as you bring it in or out, it actually makes contact with the lower holder here, and that will push the die ever so slightly in or out if you are making a very small adjustment on the dies. Maybe you're making too much contact in one area and you just need to slide it back a little bit. They also have an adjustment here at the bottom. This actually rotates in, and I didn't know this either. When this is completely locked down tight, you cannot move that holder up. You need to do it while it's still loose. So when those 2 set screws are out and loose, the lower holder slips right in, no problem. At that point, you can start aligning your dies. Now, what are you looking for here? I am sighting this in from the side and from the front to make sure this is all nice and square. These shafts have to be aligned perfectly. By doing this with the machine off, you have the ability to bring this upper die down. There is a spanner wrench, and use the spanner wrench to tighten the collet down so these cannot move or index any which way. So let's just get it snug so that way we can make an adjustment. So out of the videos that I've watched, this setup I had not been able to find. Maybe there's one out there. I've caught little bits and pieces from William Trombley's page or YouTube channel, but when it comes to the thickness, now I use 18 gauge cold rolled a lot of times, so I just took this little tiny strip so that way I wasn't smashing into it. I know that with this lever all the way down, I can make my adjustment for clearance, and I'll know when I get to the point where it's just touching. Now what's nice, and at first glance when I bought this machine, there's an open hole right here where there's a knob that you can manually move. Now with the machine off, you can see the stroke. I will make the stroke more so it's easier to see. Now you can see it go up and down, and I have the ability to get down in line with the actual die holders, put my sheet metal in there, and I can test it for the clearance that I want. The cool part is, as long as the lower collet is just snug and not tight, I can use this lower adjustment to come up. Now you guys aren't going to see this, but it will move this die up very little bit at a time, and then you can just spin this manually so you don't have to worry about crushing the tooling into itself. Or you can find the sweet spot down below, leave it, bring it up until it grabs just a little bit. This is the learning curve that I'm talking about. These are the things that I didn't know when I started. Right now, it is barely contacting that piece of sheet metal. And this is a thumbnail shrinking die. What the thumbnail shrinking die's main function is when you shove the sheet metal in, it gathers, it puts a bead is what it looks like when you feed it through. That thumb in the center is pulling a bead into, it's gathering the metal, and when you pull it out, that metal is being forced in on itself and gathered. It's making the metal in the center thicker. But here's the caveat. I bought these are from Trick Tools. They're the Fulton thumbnail shrinking dies. It's what everybody told me to buy. They were the best quality, yada yada. And they work great, don't get me wrong. But if you don't know how to set it and figure out what the adjustment is, you're gonna get a stretch at the same time. So I wasn't understanding, well, in the metal shaping class I took with Jake, he would feed the metal in and he just gave you the term pull it out and down. There's so much more finesse that goes with that. You don't necessarily just want to pull and force the metal down, because then you're bending, you're putting form into the panel. As you pull it out and it's gathering the metal, it's getting thicker, and that's what's causing it to roll over. But really, you want to work that sheet metal with the curvature that you're creating. You don't necessarily have to force it down, but go with the shape of the panel. Every time you feed that into the thumbnail die and back out, you're getting a little bit more of a shrink where it's going to start curling over, and you just go with it. But what you don't want is you do not want these set so tight that you have chatter. In one of the videos that I saw, if you took a piece of paper in here and you turn the machine on, it will actually leave an imprint if the machine is touching in one area too much or the other. And you can actually see if the thumb in the center is making contact where it should not at all. The only area that you want the thumbnail dies to actually be contacting is where it's just contacting the thickness that you are using. And then as you pull it out, it's gathering that. You want it to gather and pull that thumb that where it put the bead into it in on itself, but you don't want it to be smashing the metal where it's putting a stretch in it and doing the opposite of what you're trying to do. So a piece of paper was really handy to see where the marks are where it's hitting. Once you have the alignment where you need it to be and the clearance where you need it to be, you can then tighten everything down. If you need the die, you can see it will slide back and forth ever so slightly. If you have everything clearing, you can adjust this side set screw till it just makes contact, because you don't want that slop in there. And when it just makes contact, you're right up against it where it's locked that side, and then you can bring in this set screw here, and with an Allen, you just crank down on that. Now we can take the spanner wrench, tighten the lower collet. We can bring this back up to the top, and now we know that when I'm going to run the material that I'm going to put in here, it is all set where I need it to be, and it's actually going to gather the metal and pull it back out, and I'm not going to get a stretch when I'm trying to shrink the metal. I have a real small piece of scrap here that I just want to show you guys what the thumbnail shrinking dies actually do and how much shrink it will put in there and how fast. Now you can see just on this piece of scrap how it starts really shrinking this entire edge down. You are going to be likely working on something that's more of a curvature than what scrap piece I have here. This is just as a quick demo to show you. What you would end up doing is, say this is going to be your flat, maybe it's a inner wheel well. You would bring the dies into and go across up to your light line, the area that you're going to have the flat surface, and then you're going to try to evenly come back in and shrink it. You go in a little bit less each time as you go across the panel, and that's going to bring all of that metal and gather this edge to bring it up over. And I know a lot of you guys are thinking, that thing looks like hell. That's what I thought at first too. If you have a power hammer, a planishing hammer, or an English wheel, you then come back in and you wheel this out, and you will see that this has a really nice curvature to it. This is shrinking, and then when you come back through and you wheel it, it's ironing out the ripples and the waves, and you're getting that shrink evenly over that edge to where it makes a nice shape. This is where the learning curve comes of, well, what do you use the Pullmax for? What do you use a kick shrinker for that we've showed you guys? And understand how much shrink is this going to introduce with even just one path. That was where I messed up. Some of the other functions that this machine does is it will not only do shrinking with thumbnail dies, but it will also have the opportunity to bead. Now, typically you could use a bead roller to do beading. This has a different advantage because this is going to stretch the bead a lot more. It's going to give you a lot cleaner of an edge. If you're ever trying to put just a round bead into a floor pan for strength, a lot of times when you get to the end, unless you have a coining tool, which is basically a gasket hole puncher cut in half to coin the end of that bead, it just looks washed out. What's nice is that you can use beading tools. This was also bought at Trick Tools. It gives you the nice crisp edge around the bead. So what this does, this would be your lower holder. It indexes into it, and then you put your upper, which is just the bead itself, into it. They sell these in different sizes, and you can do one side and run it through. You have a fence, so maybe you're making a part and you already know what the distance and the offset is. You just slide your fence up to wherever you need that depth to be from the bead. Maybe you're doing a roof where it has the beads that go from front to back in the roof for strength. If you have this bead in here, you can set the depth all the way out and run the bead consistently for a nice long panel, and it's going to have a ton of strength put into that bead. This is forming, but I feel like it is putting some shape because you are stretching the metal when you force it into here. Where a bead roller is doing strictly forming, it's not necessarily going to get the same amount of depth that you would get out of a Pullmax. So you're going to get a lot more strength with your floor dies. The other cool thing that it does is maybe you want to have a bead in a radius. If you take the fence off, there is a radius maker which has an upper and lower. So you can set the depth. So let's use an example of doing a wheel well again. Maybe you want to tip a flat piece of sheet metal over to have a very nice radius onto the flat portion of the wheel well, and you want that radius to be perfect. So if you know what the radius needs to be, you can measure from the center of this pivoting point, and all it's going to do is clamp the metal in the back of the machine, and you can feed the part through. So if you have a round piece of sheet metal, not a bent up one, you can actually feed it. So what it'll do is it clamps back here in the center, and it will feed it through the jaws, through the reciprocating hammer, in whatever bead you put through there. Here's what's cool. This to me is the biggest game changer. I didn't buy this machine just to do thumbnail shrinking dies, and I did not just buy it to do radius beads. What I liked about this machine the most, and the main reason, was because when it comes to very specific profiles, I'm going to use the 61 Impala as an example. We have a very damaged quarter panel. We could probably get away with using a bead roller and the English wheel only, but I feel like to be consistent, to have a fence, yes, our bead roller has a fence, but it changes. The depth changes, and although we can adjust the depth on our bead roller too, when you want to make a die that is very specific shape, what we had to do, we actually made a die, our very first die, right out of the gate. I bought the machine, I went down, I bought a bunch of, what I bought was 1.5 inch cold rolled tool steel. This is just 1018 solid steel. Last week, we showed you how to make that really specific block out of body filler and Play-Doh to make a custom profile. Now I want to take that a step further and show you guys the details in taking this square stock, transferring that onto it with a blue Dykem layout fluid. We sprayed it onto one face. We then put that profile up against this steel, and then we actually went over. Now we have a very nice look at the tooling itself. So if you imagine these dies that are the thumbnail dies being the square stock sitting in here for an upper and a lower, the reason that I chose 1.5 inch was because I only have so much room here, and I know I'm going to be milling off some of this profile to make the shape that I want. The goal here is that I want to create a custom bead or a bead that's already existing. In our case, the Impala's bead has a really sharp edge that comes way out and it dips way back in, and while it comes back out, it then blends right into an area that's formed, and it's curved all the way for the entire duration of the quarter panel. In order to make that bead perfect, I thought this machine was the perfect ideal setup. When we take that body filler and we create the profile of the quarter panel bead that I want to make from point A to point B, I can then transfer that to this square stock, scribe along the edge of that square stock into the Dykem, and then what we do is we chuck this up into the mill on the Bridgeport, and we actually used an end mill to get rid of the bulk of it, and then I just used different radius end mills to create the shape that we wanted. Now in this case, this is the finished part, but I want to show you guys, we took the body filler and the Play-Doh and we made another profile. This edge from here out had been hit and was just wavy. We wanted to get something that was a really nice clean part where it wasn't going to take a bunch of body filler to make it straight. So we poured our mold into that profile. What we did is we picked the best area on the truck for the Willys project, pulled that mold off, and then transferred this onto the steel. Once we scribed it, we milled out the majority, and this is where I talked about using the round end mill. that round end mill, I could come in, and as long as I'm watching it from the front side, I can watch the scribe line and I know that I'm creating a nice square blank that I can then go back and forth and mill out. There was a lot of things that I learned in making these dies, and that was that you have a level of spring back in the steel when you actually go to run it through this part. And so although we milled this out, something that I would do in the future pieces is I might make this radius a little tiny bit larger, so that way the spring back that you have of that shape is a little bit more accurate. The other nice thing is this die is creating the tipped edge all at the same time. So I am getting a very specific edge and a tipped flange, and although it may not show up in camera, this flat section, what appears to be flat, actually has a very little bit of shape in it. And that would be a little bit more tricky with the bead roller. It's just nice to know that you can make any profile. Could I have done this on the bead roller? Likely. But when you have the ability to, one, make something completely one-off from scratch that's your own, or replicate something that's existing that might have a lot more details in it, you can create a die, put it into the Pullmax, and then feed it through against the fence, and you have the exact squared up piece that you took off the car. Here was the things that I learned differently about when I made my own versus just watching it on YouTube. So this die is that profile that I just showed you. It was the same square stock that we started with here, and then what we did was we welded it to a piece of 3/4 inch. Now this machine is 19 millimeter. It is slightly smaller than 3/4 of an inch. So what I did was I just milled a little tiny bit off of that shaft, so that way it fits exactly at 19 millimeters into the machine. And then what we had to do is we actually had to build a jig that you have a male and a female, and that those fit together perfectly. I think this is a little bit of a learning curve for anybody who's going to create their own. This was my very first, and I don't think it came out bad for the first one. You can make these by hand. You could use a bandsaw, you could use a file, a die grinder, a cutoff wheel. You can use whatever you have laying around in your shop. You can also do this with, maybe you don't have the funds for a Pullmax. You could use a reciprocating, how do you call those things? You could use a reciprocating hammer. I've seen guys use Milwaukee jackhammers. So I've even seen people take, this is a rivet hammer for like aircraft industry. We use it for hammer forming, flow forming. But I've even seen guys make brackets that hold these, like Japan's has done, where it's holding an upper and you have a handmade die that maybe fits into a hammer like this. You guys can get creative. I'm just trying to give you guys something to get the mind thinking. But now you're creating a die. This was just scribed from body filler, cut out on the mill. And then what we did was we took 36 grit to kind of clearance a few things. When you put these dies together, they need to fit. If you put light from one side shining through, they need to be very uniform. If they're making contact in any one area more than another, you are stretching the metal. When I made these dies, I fed it through and I had clearance. You can see I radiused one entire edge, so that way you had like a feed in. So these are going to be facing to the side, and I'm going up against the fence, feeding the sheet metal through. And what I was having happen was the backside wasn't clearanced and radiused over. So it was actually stretching, and the panel, because it was causing stretch in the middle of a bead, it would start to grow upward and it wouldn't remain flat. The other thing I learned that is if you feed the metal through, just like when you're English wheel or when you're bead rolling a piece, if you put a little bit of pressure downward or upward with that panel, you can make that bead do a curvature. And that is an art in itself, because it takes a certain kind of finesse to feed the panel through. But finding the happy medium where these dies fit together nicely, you have a clearanced edge, and it's making the most contact uniformly through the center. The other nice thing is if you make them a little bit more on the narrow side, if you had to make a turn into something, If you cut the sheet metal in the orientation that you need that bead to go, you can even make the turn up against the fence and just guide it right around, and you now have a custom die that is going to feed that bead in whatever orientation that you need it to be. In order to make these shafts in line, I had to buy a piece of 4-inch, and you can use whatever you want size-wise, because some Pullmax machines have a different shank size and they have a different amount of distance in between them. There's also the Nibblers, the Lennox. They have different manufacturers of the same style reciprocating hammer, but maybe your shafts are different. In my case, having a square 3/4 inch shaft, I took a 4-inch by 4-inch aluminum block, and we actually milled that 19mm groove, came through the block, and then we have a clearanced area that the dies can set in. And I'm not done modifying this thing. I'm going to make some clamps where I don't have to have a bunch of C-clamps all over the place. But what you need is you need to have these dies where they can set in incredibly tight, and there's no movement or distortion when you go to weld these in. At that point, I put the dies together, I put some shims underneath, and then I tack welded all 4 corners before I finished welding that completely out. Once we had it in, we took an 80 grit on a DA. I evened out the finish to be a little bit on the round side as you feed it through. And then I ended up using 220 grit on the belt sander to finish out my grit with 220. And then we actually bought a Harbor Freight polisher, and I polished the dies, because the better the finish on the die, that's going to imprint your sheet metal part as it goes through. The best part was, for the first time ever using this machine, we were able to completely recreate the end bead here, fit it right back into the original piece, TIG weld it, metal finish it, and we have a beautiful looking part. And it's exactly as it was from the factory. There's so many different possibilities that you can have with this machine, and the nice thing is you aren't limited with the material thickness that you are with a bead roller. This is 16 gauge with the exact same die that we ran in that Willys Cal just to see how it went, and it did this 16 gauge like butter. This was just a piece of scrap I had laying around. It also will do thicker. I think it will even do 3/16 plate and put a bead into it. It's got an extreme amount of force with the amount of 1-inch steel that makes up this structure. This thing also has different dies that you can put in here that will actually shear metal. So you can have a shear in here and have it always set up to where it's a real quick hit the button, shear a piece, and move on to something else if you need to. It will do aluminum, steel, stainless, copper. It'll shape whatever you want to stick in it. It's nice because this set of dies for the thumbnail dies, they come in plastic or steel. So if you're doing a softer metal like aluminum, you have that ability to do that. Let us know if this is something that interests you guys, doing more metal shaping and metal art. We're going to be taking a lot of these dies and incorporating them into our builds. We're going to be making custom engine bays that incorporate shapes from the exterior of cars. And if this is something that interests you guys, please leave us a comment and let us know. Or if you guys don't have any interest in this, we'll stick to doing body and paint like we do on everything else, and just give you a different variety. I hope you guys really enjoyed this video and got something out of it. Maybe you're not as timid to walk up to that Pullmax and give it a shot. Learn as you go. Take a step every day in bettering what you do. If you guys are interested in taking any of our classes, please go to sylvesterscustoms.com and look for the dates.